Most people drive past a beat-up cargo van in a parking lot and never think twice. Mia Calloway lived in one through an entire Phoenix winter, aced her finals, and came out the other side, knowing something about survival that no university teaches. The thing about Phoenix in November is that nobody warns you about the cold. Everybody talks about the heat, the kind that bends the air above the pavement in July, the kind that makes the steering wheel too hot to touch. Nobody mentions that when the sun drops behind the McDowell Mountains in late autumn, the temperature follows it down fast, and the desert has no mercy for people who weren't paying attention. Mia Calloway had been paying attention to a lot of things that semester. Her thermodynamics coursework, her lab reports, the slow building tension in her chest every time her father's name appeared on her phone screen. But she hadn't been paying attention to the cold. That was her first mistake, though it wouldn't be her last. And looking back, it wasn't even close to the worst thing that happened to her that month. She was 20 years old, a sophomore at Arizona State University, on a full academic scholarship in environmental engineering. And up until 9:47 p.m., on a Tuesday in the second week of November, her life had followed the kind of quiet upward arc that she had worked very deliberately to build. Not wealthy, not comfortable in the way that comes without effort, but stable. Her father, Frank Calloway, had been the one constant structure beneath everything she'd constructed, not through money or wisdom, but through his name on the lease agreement for the apartment in Tempe, a two-bedroom place with bad water pressure, and a neighbor who played guitar badly at midnight, but hers. She had made it hers. Then her phone buzzed on the desk beside her open laptop, and a number she didn't recognize lit up the screen, and a woman's flat official voice told her that her father had been arrested 40 minutes ago on federal charges of financial fraud, that his accounts were frozen pending investigation, and that as his listed financial guarantor on her lease, the legal standing of her rental agreement was, quote, subject to immediate review. Mia sat very still for a long time after that call. She didn't cry. That surprised her later. Instead, she just sat there with her thermodynamics textbook, open to a chapter on heat transfer coefficients, and felt the specific sensation of a floor dropping away beneath her feet, while the rest of the room remained perfectly, insultingly still. Her landlady, Donna Ferris, called the next morning. Donna was not cruel about it. That almost made it worse. She spoke in the careful tone of someone managing liability rather than delivering punishment, explaining that with Frank Calloway's name appearing in the Arizona Republic's online news section, she couldn't maintain the association, that Mia had 48 hours, that she was sorry. Mia said she understood. She said it clearly and without shaking. She hung up and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the room she had lived in for 14 months. The engineering textbooks stacked by color along the windowsill, the map of Arizona watersheds thumbtacked above the desk, the small cactus on the kitchen counter, and she made a decision that she didn't fully understand yet, only felt as a kind of hard, quiet certainty settling into her bones. She was not going to ask for rescue. She was going to figure it out. She opened her laptop and searched cheapest cargo van Phoenix under $600. It was 6:14 in the morning. Outside, the desert was cold and turning slowly gold, and she had 47 hours and 28 minutes left. She found the listing on a classified site that looked like it hadn't been updated since 2009. Plain text, no photos, just a description that read 2003 Ford E250 cargo van, white runs, $550 firm, no lowball Tempe. There was a phone number and a name, Roy. She called at 7 a.m., and a man answered on the second ring, with the kind of voice that belongs to someone who has been awake for hours already. The voice of someone whose mornings start before the sun has finished deciding what kind of day it wants to be. She told him she was interested. He asked if she had cash. She said she would by noon. He said to come to the address on Mesa Drive before 2 p.m. or he'd sell it to someone else, and she believed him. She spent the next 4 hours doing what she had promised herself she wouldn't do, going through her father's storage unit in Tempe, the 10 by 10 space he'd been paying $60 a month for, filled with the accumulated equipment of a man who bought things with enthusiasm and used them with inconsistency. His Canon camera, his MacBook from 3 years ago, his dive watch still in the box. None of it had been seized because none of it was technically his anymore. He'd gifted the storage unit contents to Mia in writing 8 months ago during a period of what he'd called financial reorganization, which she now understood as the early stages of something much worse. She drove to 3 pawn shops and a second-hand electronics store. She walked out with $810. She drove to Mesa Drive with $550 in an envelope and the particular feeling of someone who has made a decision they can't take back and has decided that's fine. Roy Hatch was 61 years old, with the kind of weathered hands that come from decades of working with physical things. Not from performance, but from use. He showed her the van without ceremony, let her start it twice, pointed out the rear driver's side door that stuck if you didn't lift it slightly when you turned the handle. She paid him. He counted the bills with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done many transactions he didn't particularly enjoy, then folded the envelope and put it in his chest pocket. Then he did something she wasn't expecting. He took a folded piece of paper from the same pocket, separate from the money, as if he'd carried it there for a different purpose entirely, and held it out to her. It was a handwritten list, 12 items, numbered in small, careful print, in ink that had bled slightly at the edges, like it had been written somewhere humid. She looked at him, and he looked back at her, with the neutral expression of someone who had already decided how much explaining he was going to do, which was very little. He said, "Read it before it gets dark." She started to ask him what it was for. He had already turned and was walking back toward the garage. She stood in the afternoon sun with the paper in her hand and the van's keys pressing into her palm and a feeling she couldn't name yet. Not hope exactly. Not its opposite either, but something in between. Something that felt like the first equation in a problem that was going to take a long time to solve. She read the list twice standing in his driveway. The first item was underlined twice. Insulate the floor first. Everyone forgets the floor. Further down, number 4 said moisture will be your second problem. Number 7 said, learn the parking laws for every city you stop in before you stop. Number 11 said, find the others. They already know what you need to know. Then she drove away. She didn't know yet that Roy Hatch was the most important stranger she would ever meet. She didn't know yet that he was still living in a van himself. She just knew his handwriting was very careful and very clear, and that whatever he had written it for someone who was going to need it. Nobody tells you about the cold in a cargo van at night in Phoenix in November, and Mia had already established that as a category of experience that arrives without warning. But what she hadn't anticipated was the specific quality of that cold, not the clean, sharp cold of mountain air or the dramatic cold of a snowstorm, but the flat, dense, metallic cold that comes through sheet steel in a parking lot at 2 a.m., rising from the ground through the chassis and the floor pan and into the air around your body, with a patience that feels almost deliberate, almost personal, like it has been waiting for you specifically. She had parked the van in the Walmart lot on Baseline Road in Phoenix that first night, having chosen it from a brief and panicked internet search of where can you park overnight legally Phoenix. And she had arranged her sleeping bag on the bare metal floor and told herself that it would be fine, that she had slept in worse discomfort, that discomfort was not danger. Before she slept, she had tried the cigarette lighter socket. It worked when the key was in accessory position, and she left her phone plugged in with the key turned just far enough to hold the circuit, a calculation she had made quickly and would not repeat once she understood what it cost in battery drain. But that got her through the night with enough charge to matter. She was wrong about the second part. By midnight, she was cold. By 1 a.m., she was shivering in a way that wasn't stopping when she pulled the sleeping bag tighter. By 2:30 a.m., she was awake and rigid and aware, with the specific clarity that extreme physical discomfort produces, that she had made several significant errors in judgment. She reached for her phone, 4% battery, and called Jonah Reese, her lab partner and the closest thing she had to a best friend at ASU, the person whose couch she had mentally designated as her emergency option and then rejected out of something that felt like pride but might have been something else. Jonah didn't answer. She stared at the ceiling of the van, which was approximately 4 feet above her face and radiating cold downward in a steady, invisible stream, and she thought about what she actually knew. She was an environmental engineering student with a 3.9 GPA who had spent the past semester studying heat transfer, thermodynamics, and materials science. She knew that the human body loses heat through conduction, convection, radiation, and evaporation, and that a metal vehicle with no insulation and no internal heat source was essentially a custom-designed machine for accelerating all 4 processes simultaneously. She also knew she was lying on the floor, which she now understood was a catastrophic error. Roy's note had said this, underlined twice, and she had read it and nodded, and then completely failed to act on it because she'd run out of daylight. She sat up in the dark and got her notebook from her backpack and turned on her phone's flashlight for 90 seconds, long enough to write down 4 columns. Surface area, material, thermal conductivity, priority. The van had approximately 140 square feet of exposed interior surface at 0 Fahrenheit ambient. The heat loss rate through untreated steel was roughly, she calculated by memory, 6 to 8 times higher than through 1 inch of rigid foam insulation. She turned the flashlight off and lay back down and added layers from her bag methodically. A second pair of socks, a hoodie over her jacket, and she spent the remaining hours until dawn doing something that she would later identify as the most useful mental exercise of her entire undergraduate education, designing the solution from first principles, with almost no money, working entirely from what she knew. By 5:47 a.m., she had a materials list, a budget of $130, and a plan. She was cold in a way that had settled deep into her joints and wasn't leaving quickly. She was also, and this surprised her, not afraid. She was angry, and then underneath the anger, something harder and more durable. She was focused. She drove to Build Right Hardware in Mesa at 7:30 a.m., looking like exactly what she was, someone who had slept badly in the wrong temperature in yesterday's clothes. And she walked the insulation aisle with her notebook open and her calculations written in the tight shorthand she used for lab reports, and she was so absorbed in cross-referencing R values against price per square foot that she didn't notice the employee watching her until he spoke. His name tag said Carlos. He was 34, with a solid build that came from actual physical work, and he was leaning against the end of the display rack with the particular expression of someone who had already constructed an entire narrative about what she was doing there and found it mildly amusing. He said, "Can I help you find something, or are you writing a novel about foam board?" She looked up at him. She was tired and cold, and she had $260 left to her name, and she had not slept more than 2 hours in the past 36. And something about his tone, not mean, just the casual amusement of someone who had decided she was a minor spectacle, produced in her a very clean, very specific kind of energy. She turned her notebook toward him and said, "I need to insulate a 2003 Ford E250 cargo van interior for winter survival. The floor is the highest priority because ground temperature in Phoenix averages 35 Fahrenheit in November, and the thermal conductivity of the floor pan steel is approximately 50 watts per meter Kelvin. I'm working with $130 for materials. Tell me if this list is right." There was a pause. Carlos looked at the notebook. His expression changed in a way that was not quite what she expected. Not embarrassment exactly, more like recalibration, the look of someone adjusting a calculation they'd made too quickly. He took the notebook. He was quiet for what felt like a long time, reading. Then, he said without looking up, "You've got the wrong adhesive. The spray contact cement you've listed here degrades at temperature extremes. Use foam board construction adhesive instead. It's $3 more, but it'll hold through a Phoenix summer too." She hadn't expected that. She took the notebook back. He walked her through the entire list, not condescendingly, not as a performance of expertise, but in the specific practical way of someone who has thought about materials and their behaviors for a long time. He had dropped out of an engineering program at ASU 4 years ago. He mentioned, without elaborating on why, and he said it without bitterness or particular emphasis, just as context. He knew what she was building, because he understood the problem she was solving. He switched out 2 items on her list, confirmed 3 others, and talked her through the foam-to-plywood floor system that Roy's note had also recommended. A layer of 1.5-inch rigid foam adhered to the floor pan, then a sheet of half-inch plywood cut to fit on top, creating both thermal break and a solid surface. When she got to the register, the total was $118. She looked at the receipt. Carlos had rung the order under the store's in-house project account, the one kept for staff purchases and community program referrals, a workaround that existed in a gray area of store policy and that she understood without needing it explained had been a choice he made. When she looked up at him, he was already walking back toward the installation aisle and did not acknowledge it. She stood at the register and felt something in her chest that she couldn't immediately categorize. It wasn't gratitude, exactly, because it was too complicated for that, wrapped around the discomfort of having needed the help and the separate surprise of having received it without being asked for anything in return. She put the receipt in her notebook between her calculations. She drove back to the Walmart parking lot and worked for 6 hours straight. The van was different by the time the sun went down. Not finished, not warm yet, but different, quieter in the cold somehow, like something that was beginning to take its purpose seriously. 6 days after she bought the van, Mia woke up at 6:20 a.m. to a sound she couldn't immediately identify, a soft, irregular dripping, rhythmic and close, like rain except there was no rain. She lay still for a moment in the half-dark of the cargo area, her sleeping bag pulled to her chin, and she listened. Then she turned on her headlamp. The walls were wet, not damp, wet, with visible water beading along the foam panels. She had spent 2 days cutting and adhering with the careful precision she brought to everything, water running in thin streams down the mylar window panels she'd built with $10 of materials, and a satisfaction she hadn't admitted to anyone. Pulling in the corners of the plywood floor she'd installed, following Roy's note and her own calculations. Her sleeping bag was damp on the outer surface. Her jacket, hanging from the ceiling hook she'd screwed in during the 3rd day, was noticeably heavier than it should have been. She sat up and looked at what she had built, and felt something that was more complicated than disappointment. It was the specific desolation of having done the work correctly and still being wrong about something fundamental. The feeling she associated with submitting a problem set she was confident in and getting it back with a failing mark and an error she didn't understand yet. She pressed her palm flat against the nearest foam panel. The surface was cold and slick. The condensation was worst near the ceiling, which made thermodynamic sense. Warm, moist air rising, hitting the coldest surface, releasing its water content with complete physical indifference to how much effort she had put into the installation. She had solved the heat problem. She had not thought about the moisture problem. She got out of the sleeping bag and sat on the plywood floor and opened her notebook and started writing. Not a solution yet, because she didn't have one, but a description of what she was observing, because that was where she always started. Approximately 1 pint of water vapor per person per night from respiration alone. Enclosed space with limited air exchange. Delta T between interior air and wall surfaces sufficient to drive condensation. She stared at what she'd written. She knew the physics. The physics was not helping her yet. She needed someone who had already been wrong about this the same way she was being wrong about it. Someone who had lived through the consequences and come out the other side with practical knowledge, rather than theoretical understanding. She didn't know yet that person was parked 40 feet away. She just knew she needed to dry her sleeping bag and that the nearest laundromat opened at 7 a.m. and that she had a 9 o'clock class in fluid dynamics that she was going to attend with damp hair and correct answers on last week's homework. Because whatever else was happening, she was not going to let any of this take the one thing she'd built before any of it started. She almost didn't talk to her. That was the thing Mia came back to later. In the way you return to small decisions that turned out to be large ones, the moment she almost kept walking, almost let her own assumptions about who had useful information make the choice for her, and didn't. Deborah Malone was parked 2 spots down in a 2008 Dodge Grand Caravan with a cracked rear bumper and a curtain made from what appeared to be a shower liner hung across the middle of the vehicle, and she was sitting on a folding lawn chair beside the van in the early morning cold drinking coffee from a thermos, and she looked. This was the honest accounting of what Mia observed, like someone who had been sleeping in her car for a long time. Mid-40s. Hair that was half gray and half the memory of brown, cut practically short, wearing two jackets, one over the other. The kind of stillness about her that comes not from peace, but from the long practice of not drawing attention. Mia had walked past her 3 times in the previous week and done what she was ashamed to admit she had done, looked away. Not out of cruelty, but out of the quiet, terrible logic of someone who was telling herself a story in which she was temporarily in a difficult situation, rather than in a situation that had a name she was not ready to use. It was the wet walls that changed the calculation. Mia came out of the van with her damp sleeping bag rolled under her arm, sat on the running board, and stared at the ground for approximately 4 minutes. Then she walked over and said, "Excuse me, I have a moisture problem in my van, and I don't know how to fix it." Deb Malone looked at her over the top of the thermos. She had the kind of eyes that do rapid assessment without being unkind about it. She looked at the sleeping bag, at Mia's face, at the van behind her. She said, "How long have you been in it?" Mia said, 6 days. Deb said, "Sit down." What followed was 40 minutes that Mia would later describe to Dr. Morse as the most practically useful education she had received in her entire undergraduate career, and she meant it without irony. Deb talked about vapor barriers and why they could trap moisture if installed incorrectly. She talked about the convective loop that formed when warm, humid air rose and cold air dropped in an enclosed space without cross-ventilation. She explained the placement of small vents, one near the ceiling at the front of the cargo area, one near the ceiling at the rear, that would allow warm, damp air to exit naturally while drawing in dry outside air. And she explained it with the specific precision of someone who had learned it through the body rather than the page, through waking up wet, through mold growing in insulation, through the slow destruction of everything she'd built before she understood why. She had been living in her minivan for 4 years. She had been through the shelter intake process twice in the first year and left both times. The first required surrendering her vehicle as a condition of the bed assignment, and the van was the only stable thing she had left. The second had a 90-day waiting list that assumed you had somewhere to wait. She had a daughter in Flagstaff she called every Sunday. She had worked 12 years as a medical records coordinator before the hospital system went fully digital and her position was automated away. And she said this without self-pity, as a fact in a sequence of facts. Mia listened in the way she listened to the best lectures, not passively, but actively, her notebook open, asking specific questions, following the logic. When Deb finished, Mia looked at her notes and then looked up and said, "You solved the humidity problem before you had a name for it." Deb shrugged. She said, "I solved it because I was cold and wet and I needed to not be." She refilled her thermos from a small insulated jug beside the chair. Then she said, almost as an aside, "That's how most real problems get solved." December came in cold, and she was mostly ready for it. The vents were installed. 2 small 12-volt computer fans wired to a battery that kept a slow, constant circulation moving through the cargo area, carrying moisture out before it could find a cold surface to become water on. The plywood floor had a wool blanket folded double over it, which Deb had told her worked better than memory foam for exactly the reason Mia could have calculated herself if she'd thought about mattress compression dynamics, rather than assuming more expensive meant more effective. The cab was sealed off behind a moving blanket hung from floor to ceiling with automotive adhesive strips, the windshield covered from the inside with a foam board panel that fit the frame within a tolerance of ½ an inch because she had measured it 3 times. She had a 100 amp hour deep cycle battery connected through a $30 isolator that charged off the alternator when she drove and powered the fans and her phone and the small LED lamp she'd installed on the left wall. She had a budget propane camping stove she used only with the rear vent cracked 2 inches, and she cooked dinner between 7 and 8 p.m. every evening. Simple things, rice and beans and canned soup, and the heat from the cooking moved through the insulated cargo area and stayed there, and the insulation held it. And she fell asleep warmer than she had any right to be given that she was living in a parking lot in December in a 20-year-old commercial vehicle. She had a system. The system worked. She had made a thing that worked and that mattered in a way she was still working out how to describe. She was parked in a lot on Scottsdale Road that a member of Desert Roots, the signal group she'd been added to through Deb, had listed as reliable for overnight stays. Low foot traffic, no private security. It was 1:07 a.m. when someone knocked on the side of the van. Not a soft knock, a deliberate one, 4 sharp raps with a knuckle, and then a voice. This is private security. You need to vacate the property immediately. She felt her whole body go cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. There was a long second in which she was just her heartbeat and the dark interior of the van and the sound of someone outside waiting for a response. She had thought about this. Deb had mentioned it, and 2 other Desert Roots members had posted about similar encounters, and she had spent an afternoon on her phone reading Arizona state statutes on parking ordinances and trespassing law. She knew exactly where she was parked. She had checked the lot's property boundaries on the county assessor's website before she pulled in. This was a city-maintained surface street with unrestricted overnight parking. There was no private security jurisdiction here. She pressed her back against the side of the van and breathed for 3 seconds. Then she turned on her phone, opened the camera, slid the rear window open 1 inch, and took a photograph of the license plate of the vehicle parked behind hers, the one that hadn't been there when she'd arrived. Then she said, in a voice she was proud of for its steadiness, "I'm parked on a public city street. I'm not on private property. I'd like your badge number and the name of your employer, please." Silence. Then the sound of footsteps walking away. Then a car door. Then nothing. She sat in the dark for a long time after that, and the shaking came then, not during, but after, the way it always did, the adrenaline arriving late and useless. She didn't feel victorious. She felt the weight of what this life required, the way safety had to be actively built and maintained rather than assumed, the specific exhaustion of being a young woman alone in a parking lot at 1 a.m., who had needed to know the law well enough to say it out loud in a steady voice to a stranger in the dark. She wrote down the plate number. She posted it to Desert Roots with the location and the time. She thought about calling the non-emergency line and decided against it, not out of fear, but out of a calculation she had learned from 2 Desert Roots members who had tried it. A report required an address, and an address was the one thing she did not have, and explaining why to a dispatcher at 1 a.m. was a different kind of exposure than the one she just handled. 3 members responded within 4 minutes. 2 of them had encountered the same vehicle in the same area. By morning, the information was shared to 11 people. She thought about that, the way knowledge moved through the group, each person's bad experience becoming someone else's protection. She thought about it for a long time. She had not told anyone at ASU. That had been a deliberate decision, the kind that feels principled when you make it and reveals its costs slowly over time. She told herself it was because she didn't want her academic standing evaluated through the lens of her living situation. She told herself it was because she was fine, which was both true and incomplete in the way that a structure can be technically sound and still missing something essential. Her GPA that semester was 3.8. She attended every class. She used the gym locker room to shower at 6:30 a.m. before other students arrived, and she used Jonah's dorm bathroom twice a week when he offered, and she worked in the library from 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. Most days, because the library was warm and had outlets, and because staying busy was the most effective system she had found for not examining certain things too closely. In January, Dr. Helen Morse sent her an email asking her to come to office hours. Dr. Morse taught advanced thermal systems and had a reputation for 2 specific things. She graded harder than anyone in the department, and she was never cruel about it. Mia sat across from her desk, expecting a conversation about her coursework. Dr. Morse looked at her for a moment with the direct evaluating attention of someone who had already made a decision and was checking it against the evidence one more time. Then she said, "Someone told me you've been living in your vehicle. I want you to know that I'm not asking you to confirm or deny that." Mia said nothing. Dr. Morse continued, "I'm going to tell you something I don't tell many students. I was homeless for 7 months when I was 24. I was finishing my master's thesis. I slept in my car in a parking structure near campus. I showered at the gym. I defended my thesis and passed. Mia looked at her. She felt something shift, not dramatically, not in the way that moments do in stories, but in the specific quiet way that real things shift when a load you've been carrying alone for long enough that you've stopped noticing its weight is suddenly acknowledged by someone who knows what it actually is. Dr. Morse said, "Your lab work this semester is the most rigorous practical problem solving I've seen from a second-year student in 6 years of teaching this course. And I don't think that's a coincidence." She slid a sheet of paper across the desk. It was a proposal form for an independent research project, a formal framework that would allow Mia to conduct supervised field research and receive academic credit for it. The title line was blank. "Dr. Morse said, what you've built and how you built it, the material selection, the thermal modeling, the moisture problem you solved mid-process, that's a real study. I'd like to supervise it if you're willing to write it down." Mia picked up the paper. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked up and said, "I have a collaborator. She doesn't have a degree. She has 4 years of direct experimental data and no formal credit for any of it." Dr. Morse nodded once and said, "Then she should have some." Her father looked smaller than she remembered. She hadn't seen him since the night of the call, and she had constructed a version of him in the intervening months that was mostly made of the feeling of the floor dropping out, large and consequential, and the source of a specific damage she was still taking inventory of. The man who stood up from the corner table at the coffee shop in Tempe when she walked in was shorter than that version, and older looking, with the particular quality of someone who has been moving through the world recently without the specific gravity of his own certainty holding him upright. Frank Calloway was 53 and had always carried himself like someone who knew the outcome of things in advance. He didn't carry himself like that anymore. He said her name when he saw her, "Mia," the way you say a word when you've been thinking about saying it for a long time, and the actual saying of it feels different from what you prepared for. She sat across from him and ordered coffee. He had already apologized twice before the coffee arrived, the sentences overlapping each other, building toward something she could tell he'd rehearsed, and she let him finish because she was not unkind and because she understood that he needed to say it more than she needed to hear it. He said he was going to fix things. He said he had contacts, options, a plan to get back on his feet and get her back into stable housing. He said, "I know this has been. I can't imagine how hard this has been." She looked at him across the table. She thought about the night the walls were wet and Deb Malone's methodical, careful voice explaining vapor barriers in the cold morning air of a Walmart parking lot. She thought about Carlos running the order through the store's project account without making her ask for it. She thought about Roy's handwritten list in her notebook, the first item underlined twice. She thought about 1 a.m. on Scottsdale Road, her voice steady in the dark. She said, "I'm okay, Dad. I really am." He looked at her in the way you look at someone when you want to argue with what they've said but can't find the argument. She could see him searching for the damage he expected to find in her face and not locating it where he thought it would be. She wasn't performing okay. She was reporting it. He said quietly, "I don't think I knew you very well." She didn't say anything to that. It wasn't an accusation and it wasn't forgiveness. It was more like a fact being placed on the table between them, acknowledged, left there. She drove back to the van that evening, along the 101, with the windows down, because the December air had softened slightly and the desert smelled the way it does. After a rare winter rain, clean and specific, and belonging entirely to itself. She had called Deb on the way to tell her about the research project, and Deb had said nothing for a moment, and then said, "You're going to put my name on something at a university." And her voice had something in it that Mia didn't try to name, only recognized. She parked in the Desert Roots approved lot off McClintock and sat in the cargo area with her notebook and wrote for 2 hours. Not research notes. Just what had happened, what it had been, what it was now. The difference between the two. Spring came back to Phoenix the way it always does, suddenly, warmly. without apology. By March, Mia had moved into university housing on a renewed scholarship, a single room in a residence hall that was smaller than the cargo area of the van, and felt, for the first few weeks, almost unbearably spacious. She had submitted the research paper, Thermal Efficiency in Minimal Living Spaces, a field study in adaptive insulation and passive climate management, with Deborah Malone listed as co-investigator, which had required a brief bureaucratic conversation with the department administrative coordinator, and which Dr. Morse had navigated without fuss and without making it a larger event than it needed to be. The paper was presented at a symposium hosted by a Phoenix-based housing nonprofit in February, and Mia had stood at the front of a room of engineers and city planners and housing advocates with Deb Malone, sitting in the front row in a blazer that Mia had found at Goodwill for $11, and she had introduced Deb to the room as her co-investigator, as the person whose 4 years of direct experimental data had made the study possible, and the room had gone quiet in a specific way before the applause came, the quiet of people recalibrating something, the small sound of an assumption being set aside. The nonprofit offered Mia a housing stipend, 12 months of an apartment, free. She thanked them and declined. She gave them Deb's name and the names of 6 other Desert Roots members and said, "These are the people who built the knowledge. They should be the ones who benefit from it." She heard later that Deb had been connected with a housing assistance program through the nonprofit's referral. She didn't make it larger than it was. Deb still had hard months ahead. The systems were still slow and imperfect, and one referral was not a solution. But it was something real, and real things move by small increments, and she had learned by now to recognize that. The Ford E250 sat in the ASU visitor parking lot. She hadn't sold it, hadn't planned to. She had cleaned it thoroughly, new coat of paint on the interior walls, the plywood floor sanded smooth, the insulation system intact and functioning. She had kept Roy's handwritten list, folded in the notebook she still carried everywhere, the paper soft at the folds now, the ink slightly faded. She had never found Roy's forwarding address. A neighbor at the Mesa Drive property had told her he'd moved to Colorado, that he had a son up there he'd reconnected with, that he'd left the van he'd been living in for a man named Garrett, who was 22 and had just lost his apartment. She had driven past the address once and sat there for a while and thought about the way help moved, not in straight lines, not from strength to weakness, but in loops and relays, person to person to person, each one passing something forward that they'd received when they needed it, the whole system invisible from any single point within it. On a Tuesday afternoon in late March, she drove the van to the lot for the last time and parked it in a corner spot with good southern exposure. The same principle from stage 1, the same physics Roy had known and she had learned, and Deb had confirmed from the other direction, the sun warming whatever needed warming. She took a piece of paper from her notebook and wrote on it. In handwriting she tried to make as clear as Roy's, though it wasn't quite, because some things you earn through decades and some things you can only approximate. She taped it to the inside of the rear door window, where it would be visible from outside. If you need somewhere to start, knock. I'll show you how to make it work. She had thought about whether to put her personal number or a Google Voice number she could filter, and decided on the personal one, not carelessly, but with the specific logic that the kind of person who would knock on that van in the right circumstances was the kind of person who needed to reach someone, real, not a screened inbox, and that she would know within the first 30 seconds of a call whether it was the wrong kind of contact. Then she wrote her number. Then she added, at the bottom, in smaller letters that she almost crossed out and didn't, "You are not the problem. The problem is the problem. Those are different things." She walked back across the parking lot toward the residence hall in the warm March sun, and she did not look back at the van. Not because she was finished with what it had given her. She wasn't. She wouldn't be for a long time, but because looking forward felt, for the first time in months, like the right direction. Behind her, the white Ford E250 sat in the afternoon light with its windows facing south, patient and still, waiting for whoever needed it next. If this story stayed with you, hit like and subscribe so the next one finds you when you need it. Drop a comment telling me which moment hit hardest and where in the world you are reading this right now.
We live in a world that measures people by the address, by the zip code, by whether they have a roof or a parking lot. We walk past someone sitting in a lounge chair beside a minivan and we look away because looking feels uncomfortable and discomfort is something we have been highly trained to avoid. Mia Calloway was a 20-year-old engineering student with a 3.8 GPA sleeping in a caravan in December. Deborah Malone was a 47-year-old woman in a parking lot who hasn't had a permanent address in 4 years. One had a scholarship, one has a remote, and 40 minutes of the most valuable knowledge either of some would ever change. Here is what that story actually say. Integrity does not live in building dignity, does not require a list, and the person you almost work parsimony might be carrying the exact answer to the question you have been trying to solve alone. We do not get to decide who has something worth hearing based on where they sleep last night. Every person you dismiss with a looking earful human being with a history, a skill, a heart, or knowledge that no classroom get them. Look up, knock on the door, ask the question. The most important thing any of us ever learn come from people we almost didn't talk to.